Hey everybody, welcome to the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina, Kristina. This is where we read books and talk about books. No special effects here. And I will be, once we get into it, I'm going to start practicing my sign language again. Because this is the book that reunited my passion for the sign language, so I'm going to start trying to brush up on it again. So anyways, we don't forget to look into Flashback Mondays, where I talk about Romantic Times book review. That magazine is still valid and prevalent today. You can still pick up that magazine and find new authors to read or reacquaint yourself with old authors. The books are there. And you have to watch my If Then. I did the magazine thing with Mystery Scene and Bookmark and Book Page and Publishers Weekly, comparing it all, and discovered that one of the biggest reasons why I like Romantic Times so much was because they actually covered books that I would read. Some of the others do mainly literature or mainstream stuff, and Romantic Times did historicals and mystery and sci-fi and romance and inspirationals. They did over 200 books every single month. And so don't forget Flashback Mondays, If Then Fridays, and Star Trek Next Generation Fridays. The video used to be really good with views, and it has flopped under 20 people a week. I don't know what's going on there. But we are starting our new series today. We were going to be finishing up Patterson. So we're starting up Victoria Thompson's Gaslight series with Sarah Brandt and Frank Malloy. There are 26 books in this series so far, and we are waiting on 27. So by the time we get through all 26, which I have, what did I do with, we will, so by the time we get to 27, maybe 28 will be out. So this is the first book in the series. This is Murder on Astor Place. And we have Sarah Brandt is she's Sarah Decker. She's one of the Knickerbockers, one of a very wealthy family. And her sister, we will get into that in a few minutes, but an incident with her sister caused her to separate from her parents. Because they are big, huge society, everybody's always concerned about scandal. So she separated from her parents, and she married a doctor. And when she married the doctor, she learned how to be a nurse. And she continued her work after his death as a midwife. And so right now she's separated from her parents, and we will approach that subject soon. Frank Malloy is a detective sergeant in the New York City Police, and apparently it's very corrupt during this time. And future books, when we get to the hardcovers, I hope the other stuff the extra chapters will be there, because those were my favorite. So we start the book with Sarah getting called in the middle of the night to deliver Mrs. Higgins' baby. You'll have to check my New Year's Eve video for her identity. She likes to go off several times during videos. She can't tell time, but she likes to go off. So she goes to deliver Mrs. Higgins' baby, and when she is working with Mrs. Higgins, a young lady walks by the door, and she goes, "Oh, Mina, what are you doing here?" And the girl just keeps walking. And it turns out that the girl just resembled Mina, a childhood friend of Sarah's, but wasn't actually Mina, it was somebody else. So the next day, she goes to check, or actually 2 days later, she goes back to check on Mrs. Higgins and her baby, and discovered that the woman who she thought she recognized was actually relative of the person she recognized. Her name was Alice, and it turns out she was 6 months along with child, and she's been murdered. And this is where Sarah Brandt encounters Frank Malloy, our detective sergeant, and he asks her, due to the delicate nature of the investigation, because she's a woman, to help him search the girl's room, see if they can find any clues, and Sarah then finds confirmation of the girl's identity, and her name is sewn into some of the clothing. So she goes to the family, and they're a very rich, very wealthy family, the Van Dams, and she goes to tell them of Alice's demise, and they're very angry with Sarah for her convictions that Alice was with child, that she may have been dating, unknowns to them, maybe someone of a savory sort, or didn't have money sort, and she gets into issues with the parents and the sister. And Sarah has a little thing in her head, because when she gets to the house, or soon after informing them of the girl's death, actually Frank had informed them first, when she gets it after. When she gets there, Mina, the girl that she thought the other girl was had already purchased brand new mourning clothing, and that was a little bit of a red flag for Sarah back then. And so Sarah helps Frank Malloy investigate, and she also, because of the corruption of the police officers of this time period, Sarah suggests to Cornelius, the father, Alice's father, and Mina's father, supposedly, those issues will be investigated later, that he should give Frank money to pay for the investigation. And one of the things they want Frank to do is to get back the family jewels. Apparently, Alice took the family jewels with her to fund her getting away. Why she stayed in the city instead of getting away, we do not know. So during the investigation, Sarah talks to Frank. And when I enjoy these books, I have to share them with you. She says, I had a sister, she began, telling him a story he knew he didn't want to hear. Her name was Maggie. She was 3 years older than I, and I adored her. She was beautiful and smart and so strong, too strong as it turned out. She didn't approve of the way our father treated his workers. He was too cruel, she thought, but she couldn't convince him to adopt more humane methods. She began spending time at the shipyards. She was especially interested in proving to my father that it would be in his best interest financially to treat his workers better. Since my father's only concern with his financial best interest, she stood a good chance of changing his mind if she could prove her theories. But while she was going over his books, she met one of his clerks and fell in love. Peter was a beautiful young man, and I think he truly loved my sister in return. He must have, because he stayed with her even after. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Maggie and Peter fell in love, and they wanted to marry, but of course my father refused to allow it. His daughter would never be allowed to marry a penniless clerk. She was to be the bride of some millionaire's son, or perhaps even of an English lord. My father had great hopes. He simply failed to realize that Maggie could be as stubborn as he. She refused to stop seeing Peter, so my father fired him, turned him out without a reference, and blackened his name everywhere. So the only work he could find was as a common laborer. He thought this would be the last he'd heard of Peter, but Maggie had conceived a child. She thought when she told our father about the baby, he would relent and allow her to marry, but instead he tried to send her off to Europe. In fact, we thought she did go to France, but she managed to escape from the ship before it sailed, and she found Peter. They were married, and by the time we discovered what had happened, she had vanished. I begged my father to find her and at least help Peter find a decent job, but he said she'd made her choice and she could live with it. I think he expected that once Maggie had a taste of poverty, she would come crawling back to him and beg forgiveness. But of course she didn't. The next we heard was one night when Peter sent us word to come to her because she was dying. My parents were out for the evening, but I went. They were living in a rear tenement on the Lower East Side, on the 5th floor. Frank winced. This would be about the cheapest lodging available. The rear tenants were built in the courtyards behind the regular tenants, even cut off even from little light and air available in the crowded streets of the city. I found her in a back bedroom, a room with no windows, hardly bigger than a closet. She was lying on the straw mattress on the floor, and she was bleeding to death. And she had given birth, and the bleeding wouldn't stop, and the baby died, and she died. So she continues to tell her story to Frank. And this is why Sarah is also estranged from her parents, but we will get to that part later. We do meet Mrs. Ellsworth. Mrs. Ellsworth is Sarah's nosy neighbor who's got suspicions up the yin-yang. And you gotta love some of the stuff she comes up with. So, Mrs. Ellsworth says, Mrs. Ellsworth looked up in apparent surprise, her wrinkled face breaking into a delighted smile. Mrs. Brandt, don't tell me you've been out all night. I certainly have, delivering a fat baby girl who made up her mind to come into the world backwards. Oh my, I hope everything is all right. Right as can be. Only then did Sarah realize that something wasn't quite right with Mrs. Ellsworth sweeping. Were you sweeping dirt into the house? She asked in alarm. Could the old woman be losing her mental facilities? Of course I was, she replied without the slightest hesitation. This is a new room. She held it up so Sarah could see that for herself. You've got to sweep something into the house before you sweep anything out with it, or else all your luck will be swept out the door. Surely you knew that. You gotta love Mrs. Ellsworth. You just have to. So, she helps Frank investigate the murder some more. And I don't really want to. They look for the jewels. They do some more investigation. And then she tells Frank about her husband. And we will get more from him later on. I told you to question the servants to find out more about her. And you might have put yourself in danger in the meantime. You've done enough. Let the police do their job now, Mrs. Brandt. Her face hardened with a bitterness that shocked him, and anger flared in her blue-gray eyes. I am fully aware of how the police do their job, Detective Sergeant Malloy. So you'll forgive me if I'm less than confident in your ability to solve this case. What are you talking about? He demanded, angry himself. I am talking about a murder that happened 3 years ago and is still isn't solved. Was this someone you knew? He asked skeptically. My husband. For a full minute, Frank could only stare. He'd known she was a widow, of course, but he never troubled himself to wonder what had happened, what had become of the late Mr. Brandt. How did it happen? Tom was coming home late one night from a case. I don't think it odd when I woke up the next morning and he wasn't there. He was frequently gone all night. Then the police came and told me he'd been found dead in an alley. His money was gone and his skull was fractured. It was almost impossible to solve a case like that, Frank said, feeling oddly defensive. A robbery at night with no witnesses, no connection between the killer and the victim, no clues or evidence. She says they could have tried. She countered, plainly not interested in reason or logic. People like that don't keep secrets. They brag to their friends. Someone who knew killed Tom. A whale plus bribes, and someone would have. Why didn't you offer a bribe then? You offered one to me quick enough. I didn't know the rules back then, and I was too grief-stricken to learn them at the time. I thought the police would find the killer because it was the right thing to do. I know better now, and I intend to see this killer doesn't get away. So she talked to him about that. Then later on, some issues come up, and the superintendent of police invites Frank into his office and invites him not to investigate the case. And so that happens. And another little teasing thing is that Sarah Brandt sends notes to Frank at the job, at the headquarters with, to come see her, or she has a clue or something like that. And his co-workers tease him mercilessly. And at one point, Sarah goes to the station herself, and they put her in an interrogation room, not knowing who she is. If it had gotten out that they had put a Decker in the interrogation room, they all would have lost their jobs. But I have another. I cannot let this go. I wrote these all down because it was just Mrs. Ellsworth, this is Detective Sergeant Malloy of the New York Police. Mrs. Brandt said, rising to her feet as well. Mr. Malloy, this is my neighbor, Mrs. Ellsworth. The old lady was still looking him over very carefully, obviously feeling he needed to pass inspection before she'd leave him alone with Sarah Brandt. I dropped a knife this morning, she said, as if that should mean something. When no one responded, she continued, that's how I knew I'd be getting a visitor soon. Although I guess you're really Sarah's visitor, aren't you? So perhaps I'd best be on my way. So nice to have you made your acquaintance, Detective Sergeant. She comes up with this stuff. It's just so cute. She supplies a little levity to the story. So then, because Frank has been kicked off the case by the superintendent, he encourages Sarah to investigate. So she investigates, and she learns some interesting information. And I have another little Mrs. Ellsworth, because they're just too funny not to. Looks like it's going to be another warm day. Mrs. Brandt, off to deliver a baby this morning, are you? No, I've got an appointment, Sarah said. Be careful then. I baked some bread this morning and the top of the loaf split. I've been worried sick ever since. You know what that means, don't you? There's going to be a funeral soon. It won't be mine, Sarah assured her, wondering with amusement if anything ever happened to Mrs. Ellsworth that didn't have some sinister interpretation. But I'll be careful. She's always getting in my videos. She can't tell time for nothing. So Frank learned some interesting things. Sarah reunites with her folks. Her mother a little bit, and she gets some help from her mother about the case, and it helps because this is the first time Sarah's seen her mother in 3 years, and they have a little talk about it. And so we're introduced to her mother, who in future books will also provide some levity to some of the cases and become interested in helping her daughter and establishing a relationship with her daughter again. And one more Mrs. Ellsworth before we wrap this up. She was hardly down her front steps, however, when someone called a warning. "Stop, dear, don't go any further," Mrs. Ellsworth cried, hurrying down her own porch. Apparently she'd been watching out her front window for something in the neighborhood that would require her attention. "You dropped your glove." Sarah looked to see it lying near the top step and started back for it. "Don't pick it up!" Mrs. Ellsworth shrieked in terror, causing Sarah to nearly stumble on the steps. "Bad luck, you know," she explained when Sarah gaped at her. Sarah swallowed down her expiration. "Am I supposed to let it lie there?" she asked, trying not to sound sarcastic. "Of course not," Mrs. Ellsworth said, her eyes wide at such a ridiculous notion. "I'll pick it up for you, and that's good fortune for you today, to have someone else pick up your glove." Amazingly spry for her age, she brushed past Sarah and flitted up the steps, snatching the glove, then handing it back to Sarah with a flourish. "There. Well, thank you, Sarah," she said, trying to appear grateful. So, who killed Alice and why? And there's some twisty turns in here. Some motive is there. And several other people get killed because they knew stuff. And the only way to silence them was to kill them. And there's some good revelations. The book holds your attention. I enjoy it immensely. I love these books. We also meet Frank's mother towards the end of the book, and we also meet Frank's son Brian at the end of the book. And it's going to be, I'm a series person, as you know. I like to read the character progression from book to book to book. And we are going to get progression with her parents. The characters are going to grow. Her mother's character is going to grow. We will eventually meet her father in person. We haven't met him yet. We just seen Brian for the first time at the end of the book, and his mother makes an appearance at the end of the book. And we will have more characters become regulars as time goes on. And it's a really good, enjoyable series. And we're going to get into some Pattersons and stuff. And I'm looking forward to Book 2, Murder on St. Park's Place. So please enjoy Murder on Astor Place and get to know Frank Malloy and Sarah Brandt as they get to know each other and start solving murder cases together, each helping a different side of the case. It's really interesting, and in the later books, the afterword by the author is amazingly interesting. And we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, who is, or Teddy, I think it's Teddy, right? Who's the commissioner and who's trying to make some changes. And we'll learn his history in these books too. It's so very interesting. I thoroughly enjoy these books. They are a really good, enjoyable read, and I hope you will continue through the series with me as we read them. And don't forget Flashback Mondays, Star Trek Fridays, If Then. We did some dragons, we did some magazines, we did some forensics, we did some Bridgertons. So please check them all out, and please hit the like and subscribe. Thank you.